France is often called magnifique, époustouflant, and beautiful. France is a unique nation on Earth. France can boast of all the gorgeous cities and historic landmarks in Europe, making the country Europe's most popular tourist destination. The country's cuisine, wine, politics, art and music attract nearly 90 million visitors annually. Its capital, Paris, the city of love, has a magnificent landscape that has inspired many masterpieces like the Eiffel Tower and the Champs-Élysées. France is the land of wine, cheese and croissants, with charming villages and breathtaking countryside. France's cultural achievements are fascinating, and the French have consciously tried to preserve them. Beyond this sparkling surface is a past stemming off misery and exploitation based on colonization and the brutal looting of the continent of Africa. Let us compare France to a dazzling coin with multiple faces. France is well known for its beauty. Flipping the coin would take us to her ugly side. This sight describes France's damage to the continent of Africa. This country that produced revolutionary thoughts and art, this alluring and romantic country, also profited hugely from the transatlantic slave trade, ensnaring and killing millions of Africans. France's benefit from colonial authority caused some countries to be pillaged, leaving wounds that persist to date. Good and bad would be explored in this video. We would explore France's history by looking at the big picture. Kindly like and subscribe to keep abreast with educational black narrative. France's history is like a recipe. To fully appreciate its flavor, one must know all the ingredients. French exploitation of Africa began with the slave trade. Africans were dehumanized and exchanged like commodities. France traded slaves less than Portugal, but far greater than the British. According to the Slave Voyages database, 1 to 300,000 Africans were forced to sail to the New World on French ships between 1551 and 1875. The transatlantic slave trade affected around 12.5 million men, women and children from the early 16th to late 19th centuries. France made 1,418 crossings, 11%. About 2/3 of slaves were adult males, while a quarter were minors. The Middle Passage killed 20% of the people whose bodies were dumped into the water. French law, the Noir or Black Code, was the first in Europe. Slaves were treated as property. Colonial life was very tough. Slaves on plantations lived less than 20 years. Thus, the colonists regularly replenished their captives. French traders at Saint-Louis, Senegal, Gorée, and the Blight of Benin bought most Africans as slaves in Senegambia in the 17th century. Slave raids were quite becoming a common practice throughout Africa. The African aristocrats created a trading network. The hostages captured during the slave raid were usually exchanged for tobacco, ammunition, whiskey, cloth, silverware, glass beads, and some precious things. Slave raiding was becoming more desirable and profitable in the 17th century, and this caused much strife in the African kingdoms. The extensive use of imprisonment as a punishment for crime expanded the jail population. The jail population would, in turn, be sold to the Europeans, and the African rulers would get quite wealthy through this trade. Europe's weapon trade with West Africa increased the region's political instability, thereby leading to more slave raids and more captives to be sold. Ashanti, modern-day Ghana, and Dahomey, modern-day Benin Republic, became increasingly powerful and lived in affluence. Other states' residents were exterminated, while some were absorbed by their foes. Many African towns and villages lost millions of residents due to forced relocation. Many Africans died, and a lot more were enslaved during slave trade fights. Strong protests were against selling captives. However, the traders' interests prevailed. The demography of the sold population was mostly adult males, about 60% of the entire population. The African communities valued women's farming and artisanal skills, therefore their sales were minimized. War-torn neighborhoods were repaired by these women. Nantes, home to some of France's most beautiful cathedrals, has a tragic African history. Nantes was the dominant port for the French slave trade throughout the 18th century, controlling 43% of journeys. Plenty of the slaves were transported to Saint-Dominique, now Haiti, the jewel of France's crown, the biggest of France's sugarcane plantations. Saint-Dominique was a hard place to work for slaves. France had to constantly replace slaves due to high mortality. Sugar plantations wanted strong, powerful 20-25-year-old captives. With the high slave mortality and limited lifespans, this was France's hardest duty. Female slaves learned basic repairs and home chores, while male slaves learned blacksmithing, wheel winding, and locksmithing. After adjusting to plantation life, some slaves were elevated to workshop status and responsible for maintaining the mill, boiling house, and curing house. Cancellations occurred on rare days off. Life in the colonies wasn't easy for women as well. Some owners raped their female slaves. These desecrations and forced concubinages produced mulattoes, whose legal status was defined by the mother and recorded in the Code Noir. Slave hunters were to intercept slaves who tried to escape the plantations to mutilate or murder them. These attempts at independence were called maroonage. Hard work, severe discipline, inadequate nutrition, and frequent disease characterize slavery. Slavery would decimate the African continent's population, cripple its economy, and set the foundation for ongoing group warfare for generations. The 19th century abolition of slavery was a beneficial accomplishment, but French occupation and exploitation of Africa didn't stop. Rather, it took another turn. It birthed the era of France's desire for Africa's resources. France colonized some parts of Africa to maintain its economic superiority. France and other European countries partitioned Africa without considering its diverse peoples, histories, or borders in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This was the Berlin Conference, headed by the Chancellor of the German Reich, Otto von Bismarck. This is a story for another day. Continue with this channel and you will get the story. The African continent was divided among the European superpowers, colonized and pillaged. In 2017, during a campaign stop in Algiers, Macron said France's colonialism of Algeria was a crime against humanity. Algerians struggled very hard to restore their independence and culture from French colonialism, fighting for independence and against foreign control of the country's resources. The French invaded Algeria in 1830 for allegedly insulting a consul. Marshal Bugeaud, the country's first governor-general, launched a brutal coup with massacres, widespread desecration, and other atrocities to weaken the reigning government. French troops took Algeria in 1834. The 1848 constitution absorbed Alger, Oran, and Constantine into the French colonies. This further allowed plenty of French, Spanish, Italian, and Maltese settlers into Algeria, diluting the culture. France went on to oppress and exploit Algeria. Algerians suffered forced labor, land confiscation, and onerous taxes at the hands of the French. The French colonial authorities used Algeria's fertile fields and unique minerals to enhance the French economy. As a result of this exploitation, plenty of Algerians lived in abject poverty. The Algerians revolted, but the French colonial government smashed the revolt. The Paris Human Museum featured beheaded Algerian independence fighters in the 1880s. Colonization had major economic and social impacts. French colonial government took abundant Algerian land from the farmers. Discrimination and segregation in Algeria hampered the traditional life and diluted the culture. The French colonial government restricted Algerian traditional languages and culture to promote French principles. The French conquest of Algeria led to the death of many civilians, children included. During one of the periodic protests, the French colonial police shot protesters, killing 102 sparking rural rioting on May 8, 1945. French colonial officials and European immigrants killed 6,000 and 30,000 Algerian Muslims. The outbreak and indiscriminate reaction changed Franco-Algerian ties and set the ground for the 1954-1962 Algerian War. 1954, the Algerian National Liberation Front, FLN, established the National Liberation Army, Armée de Libération Nationale, as its armed branch. Between 1954 and 1962, Algeria fought the War of Independence. The Algerian War of Independence shows the people's desire for independence and France's willingness to forcibly maintain its rule. France utilized harsh tactics to crush the FLN and maintain control over Algeria, despite the rising revolt. This period saw the meteoric rise in abuse and illegal imprisonment by the French forces. The battle caused much agony and left many dead. Between 300,000 and 1,500 Algerians died. French wartime atrocities, sacrilege, and torture of innocent individuals were common. The French torched over 8,000 Algerian homes, sending almost 2 million to prison centers. The mutilation of 25-year-old ANL militant D. Jamila Boupasha, jailed in 1960 for trying to attack an Algiers cafe, was horrific. Pain and defilement forced her to confess. Simone de Beauvoir and Gisèle Halimi highlighted the case, and the trial shaped French public opinion on Algerian army tactics. In response to the war, French officials purified Paris in 1961. National police attacked tens of Algerian National Liberation Front supporters on orders from Parisian police chief Maurice Papon. After 37 years of denial and press censorship, the government recognized 40 deaths in 1998. However, some historians estimate 200-300 Algerian casualties. Police used disproportionate force, murdering many and throwing others into the Seine, where many drowned. The conflict harmed the Algerian and French society long after the combat ended. France's torture and other human rights breaches drew widespread condemnation. The 1962 Evian Accords ended the Algerian War of Independence. Although colonialism and war were terrible, they left lasting social and political effects on Algeria. The battle left deep wounds in Algerians, showing how far France would go to maintain its African colonies. Senegal was left a broken nation in despair and trauma. France's colonial history in Senegal is blackened by atrocities demonstrating their systematic tyranny and callousness to human life. The 1944 Thiaroye massacre illustrates France's callous attitude towards its colonial subjects and willingness to put its interests ahead of those who served its cause. Senegalese riflemen were crucial to France's World War II war effort. They fought for a nation they assumed would honor them, but were betrayed. They were seeking equal pay with their white counterparts and demanding unpaid wages. Their petitions were answered with horrible persecution and murder. France showed its callous contempt for colonial subjects' lives. The Thiaroye massacre epitomized this indifference. French soldiers fired on their supposed allies at dusk on November 30, 1944. The actions that followed the slaughter show France's callousness towards its former soldiers. Because the victims weren't given a proper burial, their families couldn't say farewell. The public disregard for loved ones' sacrifices exacerbates their agony. The French administration's lies and cover-ups are particularly disgusting. Despite shreds of evidence, they issued a circular claiming the riflemen had received money and were mutilating just to cover up their atrocities. The Senegalese were oppressed, dehumanized, and exploited by French colonialism. Togo itself suffered a lot of abuses from the French and the powerful. In West Africa, Togo was a major transit point for African slaves being shipped to the Americas, where they would never return. Togo witnessed atrocities committed to assert dominance, extract resources, and suppress liberation. The tumultuous history of Togo shows how avarice and ruthlessness drove colonial rulers. Since Togo was a transatlantic slave trade hub, its soil was soaked in victims' tears and blood. African slaves were kidnapped, mistreated, and transported across the seas in shackles. Togolese people still remember this horrible past. German colonialism in Togo increased exploitation and injustice. France and Britain invaded Togoland in 1914, improving the situation. Colonial ambitions were driven by power and profit, not humanitarianism. Togoland was divided between France and Britain after the Germans capitulated in 1916, the Great War. This split violated Togolese expectations of freedom from colonial rule. The June 21, 1957, Payahodo massacre symbolizes France's tyranny in Togo. The Togolese expressed unhappiness with the French colonialists after a UN committee led by Charles T.O. King arrived. After years of persecution and exploitation, the public got angry. The arrest of Togolese nationalist Bouyo Moukpe caused rioting. As an instrument of French rule, the colonial army brutally responded to demonstrators' calls for rescue. Horror ensued when the army opened fire on the crowd at the Hoda market, a commerce and community hub. The effects were severe. 20 died, many were injured, and many were psychologically traumatized. The UN mission's poor response showed how complicated international politics is and how difficult it is to challenge the colonial powers. The slaughter was part of a system of dictatorship, resource exploitation, and rebellion repression. The French colonial power exploited Togo's riches to enrich itself at the expense of its natives. To boost France's economy, minerals, timber, and agricultural products were taken and brought back. Togolese hardships went beyond poverty. Society crumbled, families broke up, and governments suppressed people under colonialism. Traditional practices and expertise were sacrificed for European values. Foreign systems fragmented communities and erased indigenous identities. The colonial authorities fiercely opposed resistance and emancipation. Rebellions were crushed regardless of causes. France's strategy was simple: maintain the existing quo, safeguard economic interests, and stifle any resistance threatening its control. The Togolese struggled to rebel against their captors and break the cycle of fear and compliance due to terrible repression. Togo's problems continued after 1960s independence. Neo-colonial elements still shaped the nation, bending it to France's will for their interests. France's influence on Togo's economy, politics, and military hindered its independence, fractured the culture, and left the country in pain. Colonialist despotism and relentless pursuit of power and resources distort Cameroon's history. The former French colony of Cameroon illustrates the catastrophic consequences of such aspirations. Cameroon's history is etched in blood, and France's atrocities resonate. During the tumultuous independence struggle, the French government slammed the pro-independence Union des Populations du Cameroun (UPC) party, which represented Cameroonian hopes. Any unhappiness with freedom was forcefully suppressed by the French authorities. The Bamileke genocide's atrocities against the defenseless will forever tarnish Cameroon's history. Manuel Domergue and Thomas Deltome, history professors. Cameroon, A Hidden War in the Origins of French Africa, 1948-1971. By and Jacob Tatsitsa is a landmark account. The tragedies are unprecedented. A violent campaign of elimination by French soldiers on orders from their superiors killed an estimated 400,000 Bamileks in Cameroon. This violent act was premeditated. The idea worked to demoralize people so they wouldn't vote for the UPC. Max Bardet, a former soldier and Cameroonian resident, told a tragic truth about his 1962-1964 stay. Bamileke were targeted because the military believed they represented UPC. France's orchestration became more sinister. Many innocent individuals lived in ruined villages and were forced into barbed wire enclosed detention camps. Standardized torture drained humanity, creating mental and emotional scars that took centuries to repair. Max Bardet's report captures French prudence in these horrors. He had a terrible encounter with an officer who wanted to erase all crime eyewitnesses to hide France's role. To recognize that the country committed atrocities abroad would reveal how far power and influence had sunk it. Roland Pré and Pierre Mesmer led Cameroon's French colonial government. They represented France's colonial repression. They planned and executed a violent campaign that shattered lives and communities, shedding innocent blood. Their heinous crimes echo through history, scaring us with the value of power over human life at the expense of others. French tyranny also affected Cameroon's English-speaking regions. France infiltrated British Cameroon, claiming the British were sheltering nationalists and inciting insurrection. Special targets were targeted for assassinations and other violence to eliminate opposition. French colonialism in Cameroon caused pain, exploitation, and plunder. As the French pillaged Cameroon for their own gain, its natural wealth brought riches and suffering. French persecution has kept Cameroonian people fighting for survival and sovereignty, suppressing any effort at usurping the colonial powers. France exploited plenty of nations and maintained control over its former colonies. It persisted after these nations gained independence from colonial powers. These colonial powers still take the country's riches and resources by preserving power. They do that by installing a puppet government that is blindly loyal to them for the sake of his own pocket. The colonial powers, not only France, have left political instability in Africa, and it is just a simulation of Otto von Bismarck's idea. Divide to conquer. The path ahead will reveal these unsettling truths and how Africa's colonial heritage affects its struggle for independence and equality. This video concludes. Please remark below. We value your insight. Please like, subscribe, and share our videos so more people can learn about the black race and share their stories. Thank you for viewing.